They clinked their glasses and laughed like nothing had ever gone wrong in this family, like we hadn't buried years of resentment under the picnic table next to the ketchup-stained napkins and broken corn holders. My sister Jenny had just been promoted again, regional financial director or something, and they toasted to her like she'd walked on water. Dad raised his beer can with a grunt that passed for affection. Mom was practically beaming like a damn Christmas tree in July, and all the cousins and neighbors who'd come for burgers and cheap wine cheered like they'd all just won the lottery. And me? I stood by the grill, holding a greasy spatula and pretending the smoke wasn't stinging my eyes. No one looked my way. Not once. Not when I spent the entire morning setting up tables, or when I ran back to the house 3 separate times because someone forgot the relish, or even when I bandaged Adam's knee after he fell trying to do a backflip off the hammock. That kid never says thank you. Just like his mom. Jenny looked incredible, I'll give her that. Hair curled, blouse tucked in just enough to say relaxed, without looking like she didn't try. Her smile was perfectly white, like a toothpaste commercial, and when Mom handed her a glass of sparkling rose in a tall plastic flute, she held it like a celebrity at a gala. Even though we were standing in a backyard that smelled like citronella and burnt sausages. I stood next to the trash can, scratching a mosquito bite and wondering why I even bothered to wear a collared shirt. Dad nudged Mom just before the toast. She cleared her throat like she was about to present a Nobel Prize, and then she said it, to Jenny. For always making us proud, always going the extra mile, always being our rock. People actually clapped. I swear to God, there were claps. I was holding 2 plates, one in each hand. Jenny's plate still had half a deviled egg on it, and the one in my left had a wet hamburger bun clinging to the corner. I looked down at them like maybe there'd be a message written in mustard. Like maybe if I stared hard enough, someone would say, "Hey Mark, thanks for running the grill." Or even just, "Hey Mark." But no. I just did what I always do, I cleaned. I cleared. I went inside and started rinsing dishes while they all laughed about that time Jenny lost her phone in Cabo and charmed the hotel staff into shipping it back to her for free. I've never been to Cabo. I've never even been west of Omaha. The house was quiet in that way houses get when people are just outside, when the life is happening without you and you're watching it through the window like a stranger. The sink was full, as usual. Jenny used 3 glasses for 1 drink, couldn't decide between stemless or stemmed. Mom always says it's because Jenny's a perfectionist. I think she's just used to someone else picking up the mess. About an hour later, most of the guests were tipsy or gone. The citronella candles had burned down to wax puddles, and someone was playing Fleetwood Mac on a Bluetooth speaker like we were all still pretending this was some golden memory in the making. I stayed quiet, stacking the last of the chairs, folding napkins that would be tossed anyway, wiping sauce off a cooler someone forgot to close. Jenny's kid, Adam, had left his juice box under the table again, straw sticking out like a weapon. Nobody said goodbye when I left. Nobody noticed. I drove home with the windows down, hoping the night air would scrub the disappointment out of my skin. I didn't even make it to my apartment before my phone buzzed. It was Jenny. Just one message. "Mom's been crying for hours. Did you do something?" That was it. No hello. No explanation. Like I detonated a bomb without knowing it. I stared at the screen while parked in the dark lot outside my building. The fan belt on my car wheezed even after I turned the engine off. I could hear the cicadas humming, angry and tired. Did I do something? I don't know. I didn't yell. I didn't throw a fit or roll my eyes or even sigh too loud. All I did was hold 2 plates, one in each hand. And I listened while they celebrated my sister like I was some goddamn waiter who wandered through the yard by accident. So no, I didn't do anything. But maybe that's exactly what she felt. The nothing. The void. Maybe sometimes the loudest thing in the room is the one person who finally goes quiet. The next morning, I woke up with that text still hanging in my mind like fog on a windshield that won't clear no matter how hard you run the wipers. It was 6:45 in the morning, and the first sunlight was leaking through the blinds in crooked slashes across my floor, cutting through the dust like it wanted to expose something I hadn't admitted to myself yet. My phone was still on the nightstand, screen cracked in the corner from when I dropped it on the tile last week, and that one line from Jenny was still there, blinking like it had been waiting all night for me to confess. I made coffee without thinking, because that's what I do: wake up, grind beans, pour water, stare at the window while it brews like the answers might be in the steam. I live alone in a 2-bedroom apartment that still smells like someone else's dog from the tenant before me, even though I've never owned a pet. The couch sags in the middle, the ceiling fan wobbles when it spins too fast, and there's a drawer in the kitchen full of things I might fix someday, but never will. It's a good metaphor for how things stand in my life. Honestly, just enough working parts to keep moving, just enough broken ones to make it feel like I'm always behind. Jenny's text still sat there, smug and clinical. Mom's been crying for hours? Did you do something? Not is she okay? Not what happened. Just that hint of accusation, that buried implication that I'm the one who set the fire just by breathing wrong. I took a long sip of black coffee and opened the messages, hovered my thumb over the reply box, and typed out, "Nope." I hit send without rereading it. Not 5 minutes later, she sent a thumbs up. Like we'd just settled the weather. The thing is, when you grow up in a family like mine, you get used to remembering your place by how often you're overlooked. You learn to read the subtext, to decode the silences. It's not always what they say, it's what they don't. I thought back to the toast. The way Mom had looked at Jenny like she was holding the whole world together, and the way she didn't even glance in my direction when she talked about pride. Not once. Like I didn't exist, or maybe like I just didn't register as someone worth naming. I started digging through my closet later that afternoon, looking for something completely unrelated, an old router I needed for a side gig, but what I found instead was a plastic bin full of my childhood things. Most people would call it a memory box, but mine looked more like an afterthought. A couple of dried-up birthday cards, a ribbon from a middle school science fair where I got 3rd place, and a drawing I'd made of a superhero named Mr. Minute whose power was never being late. I was 10 when I created him. Nobody ever read the comics I made. They were all hand-drawn in spiral notebooks that eventually got tossed in the trash during a garage purge when I was 16. Jenny's macaroni artwork from preschool is still framed in Mom's hallway. One of the folders in the bin had my name scrawled across it in my mom's handwriting, but when I opened it, it was empty. I stood there for a long time just staring at the inside of that manila folder, like maybe if I looked long enough the memories would materialize out of nowhere. But there was nothing. Not a photo. Not a single piece of paper. Just the shell of something that should have held evidence I existed once in that house as something more than the guy who fixed the internet. That night, Jenny texted again. She's really shaken. She says you gave her a look. Like you hated her. I didn't know what to do with that. I hadn't said a single word to Mom at the barbecue. I didn't even really make eye contact. I was too busy picking plastic forks off the lawn and scraping congealed potato salad into the trash. But apparently, that silence said something loud enough to rattle her. The idea that my silence could upset her more than years of her ignoring me didn't sit right. It made something turn in my stomach, slow and sour. I called my buddy Dave, the only friend I've kept in my life since the divorce, mostly because he doesn't ask too many questions. He's the kind of guy who'll sit on the porch with you for 2 hours and only talk about which gas stations have the best coffee. She thinks you did something because she feels guilty, he said, cracking a can of cheap beer into the phone. People like that, they don't want to admit it, so they spin it around. Make your quiet look like violence. I didn't say anything right away, just listened to the hum of static and wind in the background on his end. Eventually, he added, families are like old plumbing. Sooner or later, the shit leaks. Later that night, I pulled out an old USB drive I hadn't touched in years. It had copies of everything I'd ever drawn, comics, sketches, story ideas I never sent to anyone. I plugged it into my laptop and opened a folder called Untitled Heroes. Most of the files were 10 years old or more, pixelated and raw, but they were mine. And somewhere in the middle of flipping through my own forgotten work, I started to wonder, what would happen if I sent just one of these to Jenny? Not to share, not to brag, but just to remind her I existed outside of folding chairs and salad tongs. Just to make her see me. But I didn't send anything. I just stared at the screen, watching my own reflection in the dark glass. And for the first time in a long while, I didn't feel angry. I felt erased. And maybe that's worse. The mind is a tricky bastard, especially when it's trying to stitch together silence and half memories into something that resembles the truth, or at least the version of it that you can live with. I spent the next 2 days walking in and out of moments I thought I'd left behind years ago, moments that had never fully settled, but instead lay dormant like something buried too shallow in the dirt. It's amazing how quickly you can start doubting yourself, even when you know deep down you didn't do or say anything, at least not on purpose, at least not in the way they think. I found myself replaying that barbecue over and over in my head, not just in broad strokes, but down to the minute details, like some forensic pathologist picking apart a crime scene no one even knew existed. I tried to remember every face, every glance, every pause that might have been longer than it should have. I remembered Jenny laughing, her hand flicking her hair back like she'd been doing since she was a teenager, the sound of Dad's lawn chair squeaking every time he shifted his weight, the way Mom watched her like the sun lived behind Jenny's eyes. And I remembered me, moving from the grill to the cooler to the trash can like I was on some invisible loop, like a background character in a show about someone else's life. But the more I thought about it, the more something started to itch in the back of my mind. I did say something at one point, not loud, not dramatic, but just under my breath. Something meant more for me than anyone else. I think Jenny might have been standing near the table when I said it, or maybe Mom was walking by with a paper towel roll. I can't even be sure they heard it, but now I can't be sure they didn't. It wasn't cruel. It wasn't even bitter. I think it was something like, guess it's good to be the favorite, or maybe, must be nice to be noticed. I said it while scraping a plastic plate into the trash. Just a reflex, a thought that leaked out of my mouth after years of holding it in. The kind of thing you only let slip when you're tired, when you think no one's listening. But maybe that's the thing, someone was always listening, just never when I needed them to. I tried to talk to Dave again, just to clear my head, but he was on a fishing trip with his brother, the kind of trip I've never been invited to because I don't have a brother, and my dad never taught me how to fish. Funny how that works. Instead, I went for a walk around the neighborhood, past the same houses with the same kids' bikes tossed across driveways, the same wind chimes jangling in the breeze like they were trying to whisper something no one really wanted to hear. I found myself thinking about those old comics I used to draw, about Mr. Minute, and how I always made him show up just a few seconds too late to save the day, not because he was slow, but because people never bothered to ask for help until everything was already burning. When I got home, I dug deeper into that USB drive. There were sketches in there I forgot existed, whole stories I never finished because someone always needed something, or because life got too loud, or because I convinced myself no one would care. But now, looking at them, I saw something different. I saw someone trying to be seen. I saw the version of me that used to believe that being quiet wasn't the same as being small. Jenny texted again that night, just 3 words. "You okay, Mark?" I stared at it for a while, wondering what she actually meant. Was it genuine? Was it guilt? Was she just trying to cover her ass in case things got worse with Mom? I wanted to ask her why now, why after all this time, after all the holidays I spent on folding chairs while she sat at the head of the table. But I didn't ask anything. I just replied, "I'm fine," because that's what I've always done. Then, maybe out of boredom or desperation or just a need to feel something different, I opened an old Word document titled The Unseen. It was supposed to be a story about a man who could walk through walls, but every time he did, people forgot he was ever in the room. I'd started it when I was 24 and never finished. That night, I wrote a new paragraph. Then another. Then another. I didn't care if it was good. I just wanted to remember what it felt like to write something that wasn't an apology or a grocery list or a polite reply to someone who didn't really see me. By the time I looked up, it was almost 1 in the morning. The apartment was dead quiet, the kind of quiet that makes your own breath sound too loud. I stared at the screen for a long time, rereading what I'd written, and I realized something I hadn't allowed myself to think in years. Maybe the problem wasn't just them. Maybe the problem was that I'd accepted the role they gave me. Maybe I'd memorized the lines so well that even when the curtain dropped, I kept performing. But still, something doesn't sit right. Jenny says Mom's been crying. That she looks shaken, distant, confused. And I keep wondering what exactly she thought I did. Because if all it took was a little silence to break her, what the hell was holding her together in the first place? The thing is, I don't want an apology from them anymore. I don't even know if I want recognition. I think I just want the truth. Not the rehearsed version. Not the holiday photo with the forced smiles and the matching sweaters. The real thing. The cracked, ugly, messy version of what happened to us. To me. And I'm starting to think I'm going to have to be the one who digs it up. Even if it buries me in the process. The knock on my door came just after 8:30 in the evening, when the sky had turned that particular shade of bruised purple that always made me feel like something was ending, even if nothing had really begun. I wasn't expecting anyone, because nobody visits me without warning, and the last time someone did, it was a teenager trying to sell me overpriced magazine subscriptions for a school fundraiser he clearly didn't care about. I hesitated for a second, coffee mug still warm in my hands, and then I heard it again. 3 sharp knocks, not loud, not desperate, just precise, like someone who wanted to be heard but didn't want to wake the dead. When I opened the door, there she was, Jenny, standing on my front step like she'd just wandered out of a catalog for successful 30-somethings in casual evening wear. Her makeup was too perfect for this hour, and her eyes looked like they'd been swimming through something hard and private. I hadn't seen her this close since the barbecue, and even then, I barely looked at her. She stood there without speaking, like she was giving me time to process the fact that she'd shown up at all, like maybe she knew I wasn't good at this kind of thing, surprise visits, drop-in conversations, the kind of drama that doesn't come with a script or a plan. I didn't call because I figured you wouldn't answer, she said finally, voice quiet, almost like she was afraid of waking something inside me. Can I come in for a minute? I stepped aside without saying anything, and she walked in like she'd been there 100 times, even though I could count on one hand how often she'd actually visited my place. She looked around the room like she was checking for signs of life, or maybe signs of decay. The living room was clean enough. A little too sterile maybe, like I'd scrubbed it down to avoid dealing with something else. She sat on the edge of the couch, legs crossed, posture straight, eyes on me like I was some kind of exhibit behind glass. I'm not here to fight, she said. I needed to see you. And I think Mom's losing it a little. I raised an eyebrow but didn't respond. I didn't trust myself to speak yet, not without letting too much out at once. She's been asking me if you're angry, Jenny went on. Not just upset. Not just hurt. She said you looked at her like she wasn't your mother anymore. That made something in my stomach twist, slow and cold. I hadn't looked at Mom at all that day, not really. But maybe that's what scared her. Maybe she was used to my eyes following her, waiting for something that never came, and when I finally stopped looking, she thought she'd vanished. She said she keeps hearing your voice, Jenny added, quieter now. But you didn't say anything to her, right? I sat down in the chair across from her, the one I always use because the couch feels too soft, too easy to disappear into. I leaned forward, elbows on my knees, and finally said, I didn't say anything. Not to her. Jenny looked at me then, really looked, and I could see the flicker of doubt crawl across her face like a crack in a mirror. She wasn't sure whether to believe me, and I couldn't blame her. I didn't even know if I believed me. She keeps saying she wants to talk to you, she said. She's been crying every night, and Dad just sits there watching the news like it's none of his business. It never was, I said, maybe a little too sharp. He's always been a spectator. That's his comfort zone. Jenny didn't argue. She just nodded, like that part wasn't even up for debate. She said something weird last night, she continued. Said you always reminded her of her brother. You know, Uncle Gary. I blinked. Uncle Gary had died in his 30s, before I was even born. I'd only seen him in pictures, skinny, sad-eyed, always standing at the edge of every photo. She said he used to disappear for days without a word, Jenny added. Said he had a way of making her feel guilty without saying anything out loud. I didn't know what to say to that. I'd never met the guy, never heard more than scraps of his story during holiday dinners when the whiskey started flowing and the filter slipped. I didn't know if that comparison was supposed to be affectionate or a warning. She thinks you're punishing her, Jenny said finally, voice almost a whisper. And honestly, I think she's scared. I leaned back in the chair, my hands folded together, knuckles white. The truth was, I didn't want to punish anyone. I didn't even want them to feel bad. What I wanted was to be noticed before I had to go quiet. I wanted to be recognized when I was still talking, still helping, still folding napkins and chasing juice boxes and fixing their damn wireless printer. She's scared of me? I said finally. After all these years of treating me like I was made of wallpaper? Jenny winced. I don't think she meant to. I think she just never saw it. The way things looked from your side. That's the problem, I said. Nobody ever looks from my side. They don't even know where it is. We sat in silence for a while, the kind of silence that fills the room with all the things you can't say out loud without burning something down. Jenny's face softened then, just a little, like she wanted to reach for something but didn't know what it was. I'm not here to defend her, she said. I just didn't want you to feel like you were the villain in this story. I'm not, I said, flat. But I'm not the hero either. I'm just the one who kept cleaning up after the credits rolled. Jenny didn't stay long after that. She left quietly, with a brief hug that felt more like a truce than a reunion. I watched her walk down the hallway, back straight, keys in hand, and I wondered how long it would take before I was invisible again. That night, as I sat under the porch light, listening to the distant sound of tires on wet pavement and the buzz of a neighbor's television through the wall, I found myself whispering something I didn't know I'd been holding inside. I didn't mean to break her. I just stopped trying to fix myself around her. And maybe that's the same thing. Or maybe that's finally the difference. The phone sat on my nightstand like a loaded gun I wasn't sure I wanted to touch, buzzing once every few hours with voicemails I hadn't listened to and texts I wasn't ready to read. Jenny had called twice that morning, once before 7 and again after 9, and I let both go to voicemail without hesitation, because whatever she had to say, I knew it would come dressed in that same careful tone she always used when she was trying to be neutral, when she didn't want to seem like she was picking a side. But the truth was, she already had, a long time ago, back when she learned that the fastest way to stay safe in our family was to shine bright enough that no one asked questions. I, on the other hand, had learned to be quiet, useful, low maintenance. And now somehow my silence was loud enough to rattle the walls they built around themselves. The third time the phone rang, it wasn't Jenny's name on the screen, it was Mom's. The same contact I hadn't updated in years, still labeled Linda, house, even though she hadn't had a landline since I was in college. I stared at it while it rang, frozen in place, until it went to voicemail again. A minute later, the notification popped up and I knew I couldn't avoid it much longer. Not because I owed her a reply, but because some part of me needed to hear what she thought she needed to say. Maybe I was hoping for clarity. Or maybe I just wanted proof that she finally noticed the smoke rising from everything we'd let fester. I put the phone on speaker and hit play. Mark, it's me, she started, voice soft, raspy like she'd been crying for a while. I wanted to talk to you. I don't know what happened. I mean, I do, but I don't know why it hit me so hard. Maybe it was just the way you looked at me. Or didn't. I don't know. I can't stop thinking about it. There was a long pause, filled with the sound of her uneven breathing. You've always been good, she continued. You never complained. You never made a fuss. I thought that meant you didn't need anything. I thought, I don't know, that you were fine. Another pause. This one longer. I'm sorry if that was wrong. I'm sorry if I made you feel like you didn't matter. That was never my intention. I swear to God, it wasn't. Jenny always needed so much, and your father, well, you know how he is. And you were just there. You were always there. I listened to the message twice. Then a third time. Each time it felt like peeling back old wallpaper and finding mold underneath. Not because she was lying, she wasn't. She really believed what she said. That's what made it worse. That she honestly thought being fine meant not needing love. That my silence was proof of strength and not a desperate attempt to be seen without making a scene. I sat on the edge of the bed, phone still glowing in the dark, and finally called her back. The line rang 5 times before she picked up, her voice quiet and trembling. "Mark," she said. "Yeah," I answered. There was a silence so thick I thought the call had dropped, until she whispered, "Thank you for calling." We didn't talk for long. Maybe 10 minutes. Maybe less. She tried to explain things, but it all came out jumbled, like she was trying to untie knots in her throat. She said she was scared that she'd lost me, that I'd vanished without warning like her brother Gary had, that maybe there was something broken in the way she loved people, and maybe she passed that on without realizing it. I wanted to tell her it was okay, that it wasn't her fault, that these things happen and nobody teaches you how to raise kids without leaving a few bruises behind, even if they're invisible. But I didn't. I let her talk. I let her say all the things she needed to say, even if none of it felt like enough. Because for the first time in years, she wasn't talking to the version of me she remembered, she was talking to the one who'd stopped performing. At the end of the call, just before we hung up, she asked me one question. "Do you hate me?" It hit harder than anything else she'd said. Not because I hadn't thought about it before, but because I wasn't sure how to answer. "I don't know," I said finally, honest in a way that made my chest tighten. "I don't think so. But I'm tired." She didn't respond for a few seconds. Then, softly, "Me too." We said goodbye after that. No "I love yous." No promises. Just a quiet, shared fatigue between two people who'd finally stopped pretending things were fine. After the call, I sat in my kitchen with the lights off, listening to the hum of the fridge and the creak of the building settling into the night. The city was quiet, or as quiet as it ever gets, and I thought about all the things she didn't say. About all the years she looked past me, thinking I didn't need the kind of affection Jenny gulped down like air. I thought about how many times I'd cleaned up after her dinner parties, run errands, stayed late, picked up the pieces not because I wanted thanks, but because I thought maybe, just maybe, it would finally count for something. And now, maybe it had. Or maybe it was too late. But one thing was for sure, something had cracked in her voice that night. Something real. Not guilt. Not performance. But fear. That kind of fear that creeps in when you realize the person you've taken for granted might finally be done waiting. And for once, I didn't feel like the one who needed to apologize. I just felt like someone who finally picked up the phone not to fix things, but to see if there was anything left to salvage once the dust had settled. Turns out, there might be. But I'm not holding my breath. There's something about reading a long message from someone you thought had you all figured out that makes your stomach twist in a way no argument ever could, because when the words come flat on a screen, with no voice to dress them up, you start realizing just how much weight people can hide between polite punctuation and perfectly measured sympathy. Jenny's message came through just after noon the next day, and it was longer than anything she'd ever written to me that didn't involve instructions, reminders, or lists of things Mom needed picked up from the store before a family dinner. I didn't ask to be the favorite, it began, which was already a red flag, because nobody really has to ask for that kind of thing when it's handed to them on a silver platter before they can even spell their own name. She said she felt like I was blaming her for something she didn't control, for how things always landed in her favor, for how Mom and Dad seemed to light up the moment she walked into any room, even when she hadn't done anything to earn it. She said she hated being put on a pedestal sometimes, that it felt like pressure more than praise, that she couldn't breathe without wondering who she was going to disappoint next. But she also said, and this was the part that made me stop scrolling and lean back in my chair like I needed more room to absorb it, that there were nights in college when she cried herself to sleep because she knew Mom was watching too closely and Dad was never really there. And even though she had the spotlight, it felt like being on a stage with no exit. I sat with that for a long while, sipping cold coffee and staring at the ceiling like it might have something useful to say. It's strange hearing pain from someone who always seemed so shiny, so untouchable, so perfectly positioned to win every family game before the rest of us even knew we were playing. And yet, there it was written in plain text, on my phone, like a secret she'd been dying to say out loud, but only now had the courage to type. I didn't want it to be like this, she wrote. I know you think I took more than my share, but I wasn't trying to. I just got used to being the one they turned to. And yeah, sometimes I leaned into it because I didn't want to lose it. That attention, that warmth. But it wasn't as sweet as it looked from your side. Not always. I didn't reply right away. I let the message sit, let the air grow still in my apartment while the hum of the refrigerator filled the silence with a kind of artificial calm. I knew I had things to say, but I didn't want to fire back out of instinct. I didn't want to play the game where we traded pain like poker chips, trying to outbid each other's scars. So I waited until late that night, after I'd gone for a walk through the neighborhood, after I'd passed 3 houses with glowing windows and laughing families, and wondered what it would feel like to walk into one of them and actually believe I belonged there. When I finally replied, it was shorter than I expected. Just this, but you kept showing up to get the gold star. I hit send before I could overthink it, before I could polish it into something less bitter or more compassionate. I meant it. I still do. The next morning, she sent something I didn't expect, a story I'd never heard before, one that turned a key in a door I didn't know was still locked. I had a breakdown during sophomore year, she wrote. Flunked a class, stopped going to therapy, started drinking more than I should have. Mom and Dad never told you, but they panicked. Didn't want anyone to know. So they asked you to drop by when you were visiting friends in Boston. Remember that? That was them sending you to check on me without saying that's what it was. You brought me soup, sat on the floor with me and watched reruns of The Simpsons. You probably thought it was your idea. I remembered that trip. I'd convinced myself it was spontaneous, just a good brother thing, and I had no idea my visit was a mission assigned to me behind closed doors. Suddenly the puzzle pieces shifted, and I saw the outlines of something I'd never noticed. How often they'd used me as the backup, the safety net, the silent support beam they never thanked but always expected to hold firm. That memory, me sitting on Jenny's dorm room floor while she cried during commercials and said she was just stressed, hit different now. At the time, I thought I was helping her because I was a good brother. Turns out I was helping her because our parents didn't trust her to ask for help herself, and they didn't trust themselves to handle it if she did. I called her that evening. Not to fight, not to rehash, but just to hear her voice. We didn't talk long, and we didn't go deep. But when I asked her why she never told me the truth about that night in Boston, she said, because you were the only person who didn't make me feel broken. You were just there. No judgment. No big speech. Just there. And that hurt in a way I wasn't prepared for. Because all I've ever wanted, all I've ever waited for, was for someone to be just there for me too. I still don't know what to do with that. I don't know if I'm ready to forgive everything just because the story turned out to have more cracks than I realized. But I do know this. Whatever role I played in her life, I didn't audition for it. I was cast without knowing, handed a script I never got to read. And now I'm finally rewriting my lines. Not to win, not to punish, but because I need a version of this life that makes sense when I say it out loud, even if I'm the only one who hears it. It's strange how a single image, something so mundane and routine, can wedge itself into your memory like a thorn under the skin, small enough to overlook in the moment, but sharp enough to sting later when you least expect it. I hadn't thought much about that plate, not until a few days had passed, and I started digging back through the barbecue moment by moment like some stubborn detective trying to piece together a crime that may never have happened. The scene kept coming back to me in flashes, the lawn chair squeaking under Dad's weight, the sound of Jenny's heels clicking across the stone path, the subtle way Mom's eyes darted over me and landed, as always, somewhere else. But that plate, Jenny's plate, kept showing up in the margins of my thoughts, haunting me like a ghost with unfinished business. I remembered holding it in my right hand, the weight of it perfectly balanced with another one stacked beneath, bits of mustard and broken potato chip corners clinging to the surface like leftovers from a celebration I was never really part of. It was greasy, just slightly, the kind of smudged that makes your fingers itch for a paper towel. I remember staring at it for a second too long, standing near the trash can while the sun began to sink behind the maple trees like it had somewhere better to be. And I remember saying something. Not loudly, not clearly, and maybe not even on purpose, but the words had left my mouth all the same. I hadn't planned it. I didn't even know they were coming until I heard them hanging there in the air, quiet and poisonous like secondhand smoke. I hope the spotlight keeps you warm when no one's clapping anymore. It was barely a whisper. It wasn't meant to be heard. Or maybe it was, by someone. Maybe I needed it to escape, to leak out of me like pressure from a valve that had been welded shut for years. I wasn't sure if it had been directed at Jenny or at Mom, or maybe at both of them, but the words had weight. They hung in the air long after I'd tossed the plate into the trash and moved on to wiping down the folding table. And now, sitting at my kitchen table days later, I couldn't stop hearing that line over and over again, like it was stuck on a loop just behind my eyes. Maybe that's what Mom heard. Maybe she caught those words and stitched them to every quiet look I'd given her that day, built a story around them like a house with no foundation. I never meant for her to hear it. Or maybe I did. Or maybe it didn't matter, because some things once said can't be taken back, no matter how soft they land. Jenny called that evening, her voice different this time, less cautious, more raw. Mom said she's been hearing it in her dreams, she said without even saying hello. That line. She said she's sure you said it, and she doesn't know what it means, but it scared her. I didn't lie. I didn't deflect. I just said, I don't remember meaning for her to hear it. Jenny was quiet for a long time. I could hear her breathing, could hear the distant clink of a glass in her hand, maybe wine, maybe water, maybe something stronger. Then finally, she said, that line, it's the kind of thing you don't forget. Neither is 30 years of being invisible, I replied, not harsh, not cruel, just factual, like I was reading it off a report that had been gathering dust in some locked drawer. She thinks you're unraveling, Jenny said, almost a whisper. She said you looked like you wanted to hurt her. I closed my eyes, leaned back in my chair, and tried to picture myself through my mother's eyes, older now, maybe colder, a face she didn't recognize because she never really saw it in the first place. I wasn't angry at her in that moment, not even disappointed. What I felt was more complicated than that, more like distance, like I had finally drifted far enough away that even if she reached, she wouldn't be able to pull me back in. I didn't want to hurt her, I said. I just wanted her to feel it. Just once. What I've felt since we were kids. There was a pause, the kind that crackles with the weight of truth just spoken, and then Jenny, voice trembling now, said something I didn't expect. I think she does. I think she finally does. We didn't talk long after that. We didn't need to. The silence between us wasn't hollow anymore. It was full of things we couldn't unsay and wouldn't dare repeat. When the call ended, I sat in the dark for a while, the only light coming from the street lamp outside my window, casting shadows across the walls like long, reaching arms. I thought about that plate again, about the way it felt in my hand, about how something so simple had become the turning point in a story I didn't know was still being written. It was just a plate. Just a whisper. Just one moment in a lifetime of moments no one else ever thought twice about. But maybe that's the thing about small moments, they pile up until they aren't small anymore. They become mountains, and one day, someone finally notices they've been standing at the base of something too tall to climb without help. And if Mom was scared now, if Jenny was finally seeing it from my side, maybe this was the beginning of something honest, even if it was too late to make it clean. Maybe I wasn't the villain in this story after all. Maybe I was just the echo they'd ignored until it got loud enough to shatter glass. The invitation came on a Wednesday afternoon, slipped casually into a group message thread that hadn't been active in weeks, a digital echo of a family that had never been good at saying things out loud unless it involved logistics, potluck assignments, or jokes Dad had recycled since the late 80s. It was Jenny, of course, bright and efficient, always the first to organize, to smooth things over, to make sure the appearance of unity was maintained even if the seams underneath were splitting. She wrote, thinking of doing a small barbecue this Sunday, nothing fancy. Dad said he'd grill this time. Hope you can come. No emojis, no extra fluff, just a simple line tossed into the void, like a fishing hook without bait. I read the message 3 times before I even thought about replying, because the part of me that wanted to pretend like things could go back to normal had gotten quieter in recent days, replaced by something colder, something more still. I imagined the scene as vividly as if it were already happening. Dad hunched over the grill, flipping overcooked burgers with a beer sweating in one hand, Mom setting out paper plates and pretending not to flinch if I looked her way. Jenny smiling too wide and talking too fast, trying to fill every moment before silence could settle in and make things uncomfortable. And in the middle of it all, there'd be a chair, mine, or at least the one that used to be mine, waiting in the corner like a placeholder no one really expected to be filled. I didn't reply to the message. I didn't say yes, and I didn't say no. I let it sit there, unread in appearance only, while I stood in the kitchen rinsing a coffee mug and wondering how many times I'd swallowed things just to keep the peace, how many moments I'd let pass without protest, thinking that dignity came from endurance and not the courage to walk away. The strange thing was, I didn't feel angry anymore, not in the way I used to. What I felt was something closer to detachment, like I had finally stepped out of a role I never auditioned for and was watching the play continue without me, the lights still on, the audience still clapping, unaware that the actor had quietly exited stage left. Jenny texted again 2 days later, just a simple, "You coming?" I could tell she was trying to keep it light, but I could also see the edges fraying beneath her words, the worry leaking through the cracks. She was afraid of what my silence meant now, after everything that had been said and unsaid, after Mom's voicemail and the confession about that night in Boston, after the whisper over the trash can that somehow carried more weight than decades of polite conversation. I typed out a reply, "Tell Mom thanks. I'm good," and then stared at it for a long time without hitting send. Something about seeing the words laid out like that made it all feel too final, like a door clicking shut in slow motion. So I deleted the message and said nothing. Sunday came with clear skies and the hum of lawnmowers in the distance, birds darting between the telephone wires outside my window like they didn't care what kind of family drama was quietly unfolding inside the houses below. I sat on the edge of my bed with one sock on and the other still balled up in the drawer, trying to convince myself to move, to decide. Part of me thought about showing up just late enough to keep it casual, just early enough to avoid the questions, maybe even standing by the grill and making one last attempt at pretending the story could circle back to something resembling normal. But I didn't go. Instead, I took a drive out past the city limits, where the road gets narrow and the trees start leaning in like they're eavesdropping on your thoughts. I stopped at a diner I used to eat at during college, ordered pancakes at noon, and sat at the counter next to a man who looked like he hadn't slept in 3 days. We didn't talk. We didn't need to. There was a comfort in the silence, a kind of shared understanding between strangers who weren't required to be anything to anyone. When I got home that evening, the apartment was cool and dim, the only light coming from the setting sun spilling across the floor through the blinds like something spilled and forgotten. I made tea, not because I needed it, but because the sound of boiling water gave my hands something to do. The invitation still sat in that message thread, the digital echo of a gathering I hadn't attended, a table I hadn't claimed my seat at. I imagined them all sitting there, laughing too loud, pretending things were okay, and leaving just enough room for me at the edge of the table, hoping I might still arrive. But that chair stayed empty. And for once, it wasn't a mistake. It wasn't an oversight. It was a choice. Sometimes people think healing means going back. That forgiveness means reunion. That family means unconditional return. But sometimes healing looks like staying home. Sometimes forgiveness is quiet, personal, not something you offer out loud, but something you whisper to yourself while stirring sugar into a mug you're not sharing with anyone. I didn't burn the bridge. I just stopped walking toward the other side. The story doesn't end with a confrontation. There was no dramatic phone call, no door slammed, no tears shed on a rainy porch. Just space. Just a kind of gentle vacancy, like the hush that settles after a storm decides to move on. Maybe they'll think I'm punishing them. Maybe they'll think I'm bitter. But the truth is, I just don't want to sit at a table where I'm only noticed when I leave it. And maybe they'll reach out again. Or maybe they won't. But that chair? It's still there. Still empty. And for the first time, I'm not the one missing anything.